Quick show of hands. Raise your hand if you are in your 20s. Okay, got quite the crowd. Well, I'm 24 years old, and most people that end up on a stage like this have it pretty figured out. They're a best-selling author, a researcher that's developing breakthroughs in science, or an activist that's changing the world. Now, my mom over there would tell you I'm pretty cool, but I'm none of those things. You see, I'm just a 20-something that's trying to figure it out, like the rest of my peers. But I'm also here to tell you that it's okay, it's really okay to not have everything figured out in your 20s. It's okay to not know your purpose in life or still be in pursuit of multiple passions. It's okay to be grieving over missing out on a college graduation because of the pandemic, or the fact that you still have no idea what NFTs are. I'm here to encourage you to rethink your 20s. And I speak from experience. Because in 2020, I was one of the millions of college students that graduated during the global pandemic. This was supposed to be the best time of our lives, and then boom, uncertainty, confusion, depression. It was a pretty big mess. But during these very uncertain times, I learned a pretty valuable lesson. It's that people have their 20s completely wrong. We've all been told that we need to follow that one specific path during this defining decade in order to find happiness, success, or joy. But how are we supposed to follow that one singular path in a world that lacks so much structure? Which is why we need to rethink our 20s. Which means not allowing these paths we must take define us. For example, I did something at the beginning of the pandemic that I had zero idea I would ever do. I started a podcast, but I made one after feeling extra lost in life. For over 110 episodes, I've interviewed some of the world's most successful people about what they did in their 20s. The show's literally called In Their 20s. I've interviewed people like Steve Wozniak. You might know him. Created Apple with Steve Jobs. Beto O'Rourke came on my podcast while running for president. That was pretty dope. Ev Williams, the co-founder of Twitter. Dr. Meg Jay, the author of The Defining Decade. I've interviewed billionaires, world leaders, just the whole nine yards. A lot of successful people. And I've learned a lot from their advice and some of my own soul searching as well. Hell, it's helped me rethink my 20s. And I'll tell you right now, I still don't think there's one singular path that we need to take during this decade. But there are three things that do not get spoken about enough. This is the time to build identity capital by taking on a variety of hobbies. This is the time to prioritize your mental wellness. And number three, this is the time to focus on your growth, not your status. So let's take each of these 3 points one by one. I promise I will not bore you to death. And I'm going to share some advice from a few of my friends on the podcast. Number one, build identity capital. Identity capital. What does that even mean? Well, a lot of young people that I talk to tell me they're sad that they haven't found their passion yet, and that if they don't find their passion in their 20s, they will fail. I was speaking with Dr. Meg Jay about this, former TED speaker herself. She's the author of The Defining Decade and a clinical psychologist for literally 20-somethings. And she told me something very similar, that a lot of her clients and patients come to her saying that they're struggling with an identity crisis in their 20s. And she kept hearing that term over and over again, identity crisis, identity crisis, identity crisis. So she coined a new principle called identity capital. Identity capital is something we can all build in our 20s. It's also called building the foundation. You build identity capital by trying new things, things that you like, and also things that you might not like. It's all about building interests. Someone who did this extraordinarily well in his 20s was none other than Steve Wozniak, or Woz, as he lets me call him, because we're friends at this point. You see, I just assumed going into our interview that Woz had aspirations to become a billionaire and change the world in his 20s. And like probably 30 seconds into our conversation, I realized that I was wrong. You see, Woz, he had multiple interests in his 20s. He was interested in computer science, science fiction, math, reading, pulling pranks with Steve Jobs. But computers, at least when he was in his 20s, that wasn't really something that people did back in those days. There weren't people that you could talk to. There weren't any classes you could take on computers. So he and Steve Jobs were just two dudes tinkering away at their hobby, aka building identity capital. And who would have known that this area of interest would become their life's work? Everybody here has an iPhone, so you believe me. And that's what it looks like to build identity capital. And that's something that I have appreciated many times in my life. I moved to Chicago from California back in 2016 for college. Like majority of college students, I didn't have a resume, no friends here, no family. So I ended up graduating with 10 internships. I know that sounds crazy, but I was curious. I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I built that identity capital, trying many things that I loved, but also maybe some things that I wasn't a huge fan of. But that's okay. That's what it looks like to build identity capital. For my second point, prioritize your mental wellness. I'm going to be honest that I think that this is something that many young people have started to figure out. A lot of people are talking about it, which is good. So this is more a message for those who haven't figured it out yet. I was speaking with Andy Dunn about this. He's the founder of Bonobos, which was the first direct-to-consumer clothing brand in history, if you need the context. 10 years after starting the company in his 20s, he sold it to Walmart for $300 million. When he looked back, and during our conversation, he was honest in telling me that he suffered from many mental health challenges in his 20s, almost resulting in him losing his own life at one point. When he looks back at it, he really wishes that he prioritized his mental wellness much better in his 20s, and says that if you do, you can become even more successful. So, what are some ways to do this? Don't be afraid to shut everything off when you need a break. Understand that self-care and me time isn't selfish. Pay closer attention to what you put in your body. Your gut is connected to your mood, your energy, your feelings. And lastly, don't be afraid to talk to people. This is something that I haven't done all so well in my 20s. Last year, I lost my co-host and best friend to brain cancer. He was my age at the time. And during these days, I had to learn how to deal with two heavy extremes in a short amount of time. Obviously, like all of us, I had to learn how to deal with the pandemic, which was the first time for most of us. But I also had to learn how to deal with death of a comrade, something that nobody prepares you for. And during these days, I pushed a lot of people to the side, put all my energy in my work, family, friends. I didn't want to talk to them. Put all my feelings under the bed. And when I look back at it, I wish that I took the advice of someone like Andy Dunn, who told me that it's okay to talk to people. The person you're sitting next to right now could be going through something that you had zero idea about. And I find comfort in that. So, prioritize your mental wellness. And now for my third and final point. You guys still with me? Yeah. All right. Now for my third and final point. Focus on your growth, not your status. I come across a lot of young people. I've done this many times in my life. We want certain titles and roles just for the aesthetic, how it looks, how it sounds to others, the appeal. And I was speaking with Ev Williams about this, the co-founder of Twitter, which is pretty relevant these days. And he told me that he grew up in a small town in Nebraska. In his early 20s, he decided to flee and move to the Bay Area to work on a thing called a startup. But let me remind you that startups were not as cool as they are today. In fact, you were kind of seen as a loser back then if you were working on a startup. So he felt himself having imposter syndrome, looking to take on certain roles just for how they looked. And when he looks back at it, he wants more young people to focus on their growth, not their status. You do this by, if you're going to take on a new position, take some time to think about the actual skills you can gain from that position and where it can get you in life. Someone who did this very well in her 20s was none other than Kat Cole, the CEO of Athletic Greens. When Kat was in her early 20s, she was a hostess at Hooters. And then she became the vice president of Hooters, the vice president at 26 years old. And now Kat Cole is one of the most influential, easily, CEOs in history. She did the work in her 20s. She was the first in the office and the last to leave, always took care of the day-to-day, but was constantly asking what else could be done. And also, not being afraid to take a pay cut, which I understand can be scary. Nobody wants to take a pay cut. But if she identified a position that would get her further along in her career for less pay, she would take it. So to remind you, she wasn't just given these titles. Here, Kat, take this. No. She focused on her growth, not her status in her 20s. To close, I understand, everybody, especially people in their 20s tuning in right now, I understand how important this decade is. But I also think it's just as important to understand that it's a journey and life will not always be so clear. If you want to take my word for it, I literally just got laid off on Monday from my job, and I'm giving a TED Talk right now, so I think life is okay. We see successful people today and can easily assume that they have everything figured out, and they had everything figured out back in their 20s. But that's not true. That's wrong. It's been very reassuring through this podcast to see that many of our heroes, people that I've idolized, people that you idolize, also had to deal with uncertainty in their 20s. It happens. The final point that I want to leave each and every single one of you with, in your 20s, not in your 20s, everybody in the audience, understand that life will not always be so clear. What worked for someone else might not work for you. With that being said, rethink your 20s. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.